In April 2025, Beijing made a move that sent shockwaves across the global economy. China, the world's largest supplier of rare earth elements, abruptly restricted exports of several key materials used in everything from electric vehicles and wind turbines to missiles and smartphones. The intention was simple: remind the world who controls the minerals behind modern technology. But what happened next stunned even seasoned analysts. Within weeks, the same decision that was meant to tighten China's grip ended up boosting Canada's economy, turning the quiet mining towns of Quebec, Labrador, and the Northwest Territories into the front line of a new industrial boom. Today, we'll decode how a single export ban reshuffled global markets, lifted Canada's rare earth sector, and exposed the one weakness in China's resource strategy that no one saw coming. Welcome to Geo Capitalist, where we follow the money behind every power shift. For decades, China dominated the world's rare earth supply, controlling over 70% of global production and nearly all refining capacity. These metals power the magnets in electric motors, smartphones, and defense systems. But in early April 2025, Beijing announced new export controls on medium and heavy rare earth elements, materials essential to EV motors and wind turbines. The Ministry of Commerce labeled the move a national security measure. Almost overnight, shipments from China's ports slowed to a crawl. Prices for neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium spiked 40% on global markets. Japanese manufacturers warned of production halts. European battery makers scrambled for substitutes. China's plan was to pressure Western economies into negotiation. But the effect was the opposite. Nations immediately began searching for new democratic suppliers. And among them, Canada was uniquely positioned to answer that call. For tech companies in Tokyo, Munich, and Silicon Valley, the ban was a wake-up call. Dependence on China suddenly looked like a liability, not an advantage. The European Commission held emergency meetings in Brussels. The U.S. Defense Department accelerated rare earth contracts under the Inflation Reduction Act. But according to Bloomberg Neff, even after decades of warnings, few Western nations had the infrastructure ready to refine rare earths. Except one, Canada. Why? Because while others debated, Ottawa had been quietly investing for years. The 2022 Critical Minerals Strategy allocated over 3.8 billion Canadian dollars to exploration, refining, and supply chain infrastructure. Projects like Torngat Metals in Quebec and Vital Metals in the Northwest Territories had already built pilot facilities before the ban even hit. So when China closed the tap, Canada didn't panic. It pivoted. Export Development Canada, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and the European Investment Bank all moved capital, fast, to expand domestic output. By June 2025, what began as a supply crisis for Beijing's rivals was becoming a revenue surge for Ottawa. Canada's edge wasn't just mineral deposits, it was credibility. While global investors feared political risk in Africa or environmental instability in Asia, Canada offered rule of law, transparency, and ESG standards trusted by automakers and defense contractors alike. Quebec alone holds over 15% of the world's known rare earth reserves, concentrated in carbonatite formations rich in neodymium and praseodymium, critical for electric motors. The federal government accelerated, permitting on at least 6 extraction sites between Quebec, Newfoundland, and Labrador. Meanwhile, Canadian universities, from McGill to Memorial, were already running research partnerships with the EU on sustainable refining technologies. That meant Europe's industrial base could plug directly into Canadian supply lines without waiting for political approvals from Washington. According to the International Energy Agency, demand for rare earths used in clean energy could triple by 2030. For Canada, that demand translated into more than minerals. It meant strategic leverage in a world suddenly desperate for alternatives. The numbers tell the story. In the 3 months following the ban, Canadian rare earth companies saw their stock valuations double. Torngat Metals secured 165 million Canadian dollars in financing from Export Development Canada and the Canada Infrastructure Bank, funding a facility in Quebec capable of producing 25,000 tons of rare earth concentrate per year. Vital Metals expanded processing capacity in Saskatchewan with support from the Critical Minerals Infrastructure Fund, and global investors like South Korea's POSCO and France's Imerys entered joint ventures with Canadian firms. Meanwhile, new exploration permits in Labrador and the Northwest Territories attracted more than 700 million Canadian dollars in foreign direct investment by September 2025. Each new facility created hundreds of high-wage engineering and logistics jobs, the kind of employment the energy transition demands. While other nations calculated their losses, Canada quietly counted profits. As Hydrogen Europe noted in a mid-2025 report, rare earth independence begins in North America, and Canada is leading the supply curve. The ban triggered a new phase in global industrial diplomacy. European and Asian manufacturers began signing direct long-term supply contracts with Canadian producers, bypassing Chinese intermediaries entirely. In July 2025, the EU-Canada Critical Minerals Dialogue formalized cooperation on lithium, cobalt, and rare earths, effectively replacing parts of China's export dominance. Germany's BASF and France's Schneider Electric both announced partnerships in Quebec and Newfoundland to secure stable magnet materials for EV production. Even Japan, which had long relied on China, redirected parts of its supply chain through Canadian refiners. The result was a quiet decoupling, not through sanctions or politics, but through market logic. By diversifying its suppliers, the global economy reduced exposure to Beijing's leverage, and Canada emerged as a trusted partner in the middle of the Atlantic system. In essence, China's restriction handed Ottawa the one thing no trade deal could guarantee: reliability premiums. Zoom out, and the map of power looks different. Where rare earths once flowed east from Inner Mongolia, they now move west from Quebec and Labrador, through ports financed by Canadian and European banks. Refineries in Saskatoon and Saguenay are processing ore once refined in China. The result? Canada doesn't just export rocks, it exports value-added metals, the part of the chain that multiplies revenue. Analysts at the International Monetary Fund note that rare earth processing could add 0.3% to Canada's GDP growth over the next 2 years if expansion continues. That may sound small, but in an economy Canada's size, it's billions in new output, all triggered by one foreign policy misstep half a world away. This is how modern trade wars are won, not through tariffs, but through competence and consistency. Washington, for its part, can't control this shift. Most U.S. companies now import critical minerals under USMCA, meaning they benefit from Canada's output without having to negotiate directly with China. But the facilities, jobs, and profits stay north of the border. Even if America ramps up domestic mining, refining remains Canada's comparative advantage, thanks to established environmental and social standards that attract European capital. It's a rare case where being smaller actually means being faster. And while U.S. policymakers talk about decoupling, Canada is already profiting from it, selling to allies, refining for automakers, and reinvesting in next-generation clean tech. China's ban didn't isolate its competitors, it empowered Canada. Step back, and the pattern becomes clear. China tried to tighten control, and in doing so, strengthened the very supply chains it sought to weaken. Canada, through preparation and policy, transformed disruption into opportunity. By the end of 2025, analysts expect Canada's rare earth exports to more than double, crossing 2.5 billion Canadian dollars in value. Modest by global standards, but monumental for an industry barely on the map 3 years earlier. What began as a geopolitical maneuver became an economic windfall. And while headlines focused on tension, markets quietly rewarded stability. In a world defined by volatility, Canada's greatest weapon turned out to be predictability and the trust of its partners. You've been watching Geo Capitalist, where we follow the money shaping the next century. If this story helped you see how global shifts become national opportunity, check our next video. It connects directly to what Canada is building. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next resource revolution may already be underway. This was China's rare earth ban just boosted Canada's economy, and no one saw it coming. Thanks for watching. And remember, in geopolitics, control fades, but competence compounds. Thanks for your support, and see you in the next video.